The unforgiving Afghan sun bore down on the dusty compound of Forward Operating Base Horizon. Nestled in the rugged mountains just 20 miles from the Pakistani border, the base stood as America's frontline medical response for Special Operations Forces. Inside the field hospital's trauma bay, the metallic scent of blood hung in the air as Dr. Eleanor Reynolds worked with practiced precision. BP dropping to 80 systolic, pulse 130 and thready, called out the medic monitoring vitals. Eleanor didn't look up from the gaping wound in the young soldier's abdomen. Her hands steady despite 18 hours on duty, methodically packed gauze into the cavity where an improvised explosive device had torn through flesh and muscle. At 28, she was younger than most of her medical team, but her 3 tours in combat zones had earned her their respect. "Push another unit of ONEG and prepare the OR," she ordered, her voice calm but commanding. "And get me the Exstat applicator. We need to control this bleeding before we move him." The Exstat, a syringe-like device that injected tiny compressed sponges directly into wounds, was a recent addition to their arsenal. Within seconds of contact with blood, the sponges would expand, creating pressure against the vessel walls to stop hemorrhaging in wounds that traditional methods couldn't reach. As Eleanor worked, memories of her father's voice echoed in her mind. Truman Reynolds, a legendary combat surgeon who'd served in Desert Storm, had taught her everything about battlefield medicine that medical school couldn't. The difference between a good combat doctor and a great one isn't knowledge, Ellie. It's the ability to improvise when everything goes to hell. The soldier beneath her hands, Private First Class Wilson, barely 20, had been the point man on a patrol when the IED detonated. His abdomen was a mess of torn vessels and shredded tissue. Standard procedure would have called for immediate evacuation to the larger hospital at Bagram, but the dust storm grounding all flights meant Eleanor was his only hope. 3 hours and 4 blood transfusions later, Eleanor stepped out of the operating room. Her surgical scrubs were stained dark red despite the protective gown. She pulled off her cap, releasing a cascade of auburn hair that she quickly retied into a practical knot at the base of her neck. "He'll make it," she announced to the waiting team. But it was close. Too close. The recovery room was already occupied by 2 Rangers injured in a firefight the previous day, and a Special Forces operative whose classified mission had gone wrong. Each bed represented a story of sacrifice that few Americans back home would ever hear about. Eleanor checked each patient's chart, making small adjustments to medication orders and treatment plans. As she finished her rounds, she caught sight of a figure standing in the doorway, Sophia Williams, the head nurse, and at 56, the oldest member of their medical team. Sophia's salt and pepper hair framed a face weathered by decades of service. She'd been a combat nurse since the Panama invasion, and her experience made her the unofficial historian of military medicine. "You did good work today, Reynolds," Sophia said, her southern drawl more pronounced when she was tired. "Your daddy would be proud." Eleanor's expression softened at the mention of her father. Truman Reynolds had been more than just her personal hero. He was a legend among combat medics. His innovations during Desert Storm had saved countless lives, and his insistence on treating all casualties, American allied or enemy, with equal care, had earned him both admirers and critics. "I used his lateral approach to the retroperitoneal bleed," Eleanor admitted. "Not exactly by the book, but it worked." Sophia nodded knowingly. "Sometimes the book needs rewriting. That's what your father always said." They walked together toward the small break room that served as the medical staff's sanctuary. The space was Spartan, a battered coffee maker, a few mismatched chairs and walls plastered with medical references, and a faded map of Afghanistan. It wasn't much, but it was where they could momentarily escape the constant pressure of holding death at bay. "Word came down while you were in surgery," Sophia said, pouring 2 cups of coffee, so strong it could have stood without the cups. "Colonel Henderson is being reassigned to Walter Reed, new commander arriving tomorrow." Eleanor accepted the coffee with a frown. Henderson was good to us, understood the balancing act between military necessity and medical ethics. "Well, don't expect the same from his replacement. General Victor Harrington is coming to take command." The name hit Eleanor like a physical blow. "Harrington, the Hammer of Helmand." Sophia nodded grimly. "The very same." General Victor Harrington had earned his nickname during the bloodiest days of fighting in Afghanistan's Helmand province. His tactical brilliance was undeniable, but so was his ruthless approach to warfare. Rumors about his methods had circulated through military channels for years, Stories of decisions that prioritize mission success over all other considerations, including the lives of wounded personnel deemed unlikely to return to duty. Henderson was pushing back against Central Command's new triage protocols. Sophia continued, lowering her voice, though they were alone. Word is Harrington's being sent to implement them personally. Eleanor set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. The protocols that would have us prioritize treatment based on rank and strategic value instead of medical need. That's the one. Henderson called it battlefield utilitarianism. Said it violated every principle of medical ethics since Hippocrates. Outside the break room window, the Afghan mountains loomed dark against the setting sun. Eleanor thought of Private Wilson, still unconscious in recovery. Under the new protocols, a low-ranking infantryman with severe injuries might be classified as expectant, military terminology, for those too badly wounded to save with limited resources. They'd be given pain medication and moved aside while doctors focused on those deemed more valuable to the war effort. My father would have resigned his commission before following an order like that, Eleanor said quietly. Sophia's expression grew somber. Different times, different wars. Back during Desert Storm, there was public support, clear objectives. This war, she gestured vaguely toward the window and the country beyond. 22 years in, and most Americans can't find Afghanistan on a map. The following morning dawned clear and cold. The dust storm had blown itself out overnight, leaving the air unusually crisp. Eleanor had managed 3 hours of sleep before being woken for morning rounds. She checked on PFC Wilson first. His vital signs had stabilized, and while recovery would be long, his prognosis was good. At 0900 hours sharp, the base personnel assembled on the parade ground to welcome their new commander. Eleanor stood with the medical team, her service uniform pressed, despite the perpetual dust that coated everything at Horizon. A Black Hawk helicopter appeared over the eastern ridge, banking sharply before settling onto the helipad in a swirl of dust and deafening noise. When the rotor slowed, a tall figure emerged from the aircraft, silhouetted against the morning sun. General Victor Harrington moved with the calculated precision of a man accustomed to being watched. At 52, he remained as physically imposing as he had been as a young Marine in Desert Storm. His chest was decorated with rows of ribbons and medals that testified to a career spanning America's longest wars. But it was his eyes that commanded attention. Pale blue and coldly analytical, they surveyed the assembled troops like a predator assessing potential threats. Colonel Peterson, the base executive officer, stepped forward with a crisp salute. "Welcome to Forward Operating Base Horizon, General. The men and women of Task Force Phoenix stand ready for your inspection." Harrington returned the salute with textbook precision. "At ease, Colonel. We'll dispense with the formalities for now. I want a full briefing on operational status in 30 minutes. Department heads only." His gaze swept over the assembled personnel until it reached the medical staff. For a moment, his eyes seemed to linger on Eleanor, a flicker of something recognition, perhaps crossing his features, before he turned away. The briefing room was the largest enclosed space on the base, though that wasn't saying much. Maps of the region covered the walls marked with colored pins, indicating friendly forces, suspected enemy positions, and recent engagement sites. Around the scarred wooden table sat the leadership of Phobie, Horizon intelligence officers, logistics coordinators, combat team leaders, and the medical staff, Chief Dr. Marcus Abrams, with Eleanor as his second. General Harrington entered precisely on time, followed by his aide, Lieutenant Fletcher, who carried a leather portfolio and wore the intense expression of a man determined to impress his superior. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrington began without preamble, "I'll be direct. Task Force Phoenix has been underperforming. Your mission effectiveness metrics are down 17% from last quarter, while resource consumption has increased by 22%. This is unacceptable." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Eleanor glanced at Dr. Abrams, whose face had gone carefully neutral. "Sir," ventured Colonel Peterson, "if I may, the increased operational tempo in the eastern provinces has resulted in higher casualty rates, which accounts for—" Harrington cut him off with a raised hand. "I'm aware of the operational challenges, Colonel. What concerns me is the inefficient allocation of resources, particularly in the medical department." He nodded to Fletcher, who distributed folders to each department head. Eleanor opened hers to find detailed statistics on patient care supply usage and treatment outcomes all highlighted and annotated with critical comments. The medical facility at this FOB, Harrington continued, has been treating local nationals at a rate 53% higher than any other forward base in the theater. Meanwhile, regeneration rates for our combat troops have fallen to unacceptable levels. Abrams cleared his throat. General, with respect, the Geneva Conventions and our own military regulations require us to provide medical care to civilians injured as a result of our operations. I'm not suggesting we abandon our obligations under international law, Doctor. Harrington replied, his tone making it clear he found such concerns tedious. I'm pointing out that resources are finite, and their allocation must reflect our primary mission, maintaining combat effectiveness of American forces. He turned a page in his own folder, and his expression hardened. Yesterday, you performed emergency surgery on a private first class with multiple organ injuries and a poor prognosis for return to duty. During the same period, a Special Forces captain with shrapnel wounds was kept waiting because all surgical teams were occupied. Eleanor felt heat rising to her face. Sir PFC Wilson's injuries were immediately life-threatening. Captain Morris's wounds, while serious, were stable. That's standard medical triage we treat based on medical necessity, not rank. The room went silent. Challenging a general officer on his first day of command was either very brave or very foolish. Harrington's cold blue eyes fixed on Eleanor with laser intensity. And you are Dr. Eleanor Reynolds, sir, Deputy Chief Medical Officer. Something flickered across Harrington's face, a momentary lapse in his controlled facade. Reynolds, he repeated. Any relation to Lieutenant Colonel Truman Reynolds, formerly of the 44th Combat Support Hospital? Eleanor sat straighter. My father, sir. Harrington's expression revealed nothing but his knuckles whitened slightly around the folder he held. I see. He turned back to address the entire room. Effective immediately, I'm implementing Protocol Alpha 7 for medical resource allocation. All department heads will find the details in your briefing packets. The protocol establishes clearer priorities for treatment based on 3 factors: strategic value of the patient to ongoing operations, probability of return to duty, and resource intensity required. Byram, Abrams looked stunned. General, that protocol was still under review at Central Command. It hasn't been approved for implementation. It has been now, Harrington replied flatly. I've been specifically tasked with field testing these procedures here at Horizon before wider deployment. Eleanor couldn't remain silent. Sir, these guidelines would have us consider a soldier's rank and specialty before the severity of their injuries. That directly contradicts the fundamental principles of medical ethics. Harrington's gaze was glacial. Dr. Reynolds, we are not running a civilian hospital. Every resource we expend here, every bandage, every minute in surgery, every cubic centimeter of blood comes at a cost to our mission effectiveness. When you prioritize a severely wounded private who will never return to combat over an officer who could be back in the field in days, you're making a strategic decision whether you acknowledge it or not. Eleanor took a deep breath, struggling to keep her voice even. With respect, Sir, medical ethics transcends strategic considerations. The Hippocratic Oath doesn't include a clause about military rank. The tension in the room was palpable. Several officers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with either Eleanor or the general. The Hippocratic Oath, Harrington said with dangerous softness, won't stop the enemy from killing more Americans if we fail in our mission. Ethics are a luxury afforded by security, Doctor. And security is what I'm here to provide. He closed his folder with finality. I expect full compliance with Protocol Alpha 7 from all departments, especially medical. That will be all. As the officers filed out, Lieutenant Fletcher approached Eleanor. The general would like to speak with you privately, Doctor. Now. She followed Fletcher to what had been Colonel Henderson's office just yesterday. Already, Harrington had made the space his own. The comfortable chairs had been replaced with utilitarian metal seating, and the local Afghan artwork that Henderson had collected was gone, replaced by tactical maps and a framed display of combat medals. Harrington stood behind the desk, examining a personnel file that Eleanor suspected was her own. He didn't look up when she entered, nor did he invite her to sit. Your service record is impressive, Dr. Reynolds, he finally said. Johns Hopkins Medical School. Top of your class. You could have had your pick of comfortable positions stateside. Instead, you've spent the last 6 years in combat zones. It wasn't a question, so Eleanor didn't answer. She stood at parade rest waiting. Your father was a skilled surgeon. Harrington continued, still not looking at her. But he had a reputation for insubordination when it came to chain of command. Now he looked up, his pale eyes assessing her reaction. During Desert Storm, I lost my closest friend, Captain David Montgomery, because medical resources were diverted to treat Iraqi prisoners of war. Your father's decision. Eleanor kept her expression neutral despite the shock. This wasn't a professional disagreement. This was personal. I wasn't aware of that situation, sir. My father rarely discussed specific cases from his service. No, I don't imagine he did. Harrington closed the file. Montgomery and I grew up together in Pennsylvania, joined the Marines on the same day. He bled out on a helicopter while your father was operating on an Iraqi Republican Guard officer who'd been trying to kill Americans hours earlier. Eleanor felt a complex mix of emotions, defensiveness for her father, sympathy for Harrington's loss, and concern about serving under a commander with such obvious personal animosity. Sir, I can't speak to decisions made 30 years ago, but I do know my father believed that medical care should be provided based on need, not nationality or uniform. It's a principle enshrined in the Geneva Conventions. Harrington's expression hardened. The Geneva Conventions were written by people who never had to hold their friend's hand while he died doctor. They were written by diplomats in comfortable rooms far from the battlefield. He moved from behind the desk until he stood directly before her. Despite her height, 5 feet 9 inches, he towered over her. Let me be perfectly clear. I expect you to follow Protocol Alpha 7 to the letter. If you find that your personal ethics prevent you from doing so, I'll arrange for your immediate transfer to a facility where the difficult decisions are made by someone else. Do I make myself understood? Eleanor met his gaze steadily. Yes, sir, I understand your position. Harrington's eyes narrowed at her careful choice of words. Dismissed, doctor. The following morning, Eleanor performed rounds in a state of distracted tension. The conversation with Harrington had left her deeply unsettled, not just by the personal connection, but by the impossible ethical position in which she now found herself. Sophia found her at the nurse's station reviewing patient charts with more intensity than necessary. You look like you're trying to set those papers on fire with your eyes, the older nurse observed. I take it your private meeting with the general didn't go well. Eleanor glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. It wasn't a meeting, it was a warning shot. Did you know his best friend died in Desert Storm while my father was operating on an Iraqi officer? Sophia's eyes widened. Jesus, no wonder he looked at you like he'd seen a ghost. He's implementing Protocol Alpha 7 immediately. Full triage based on rank and strategic value. Anyone unlikely to return to combat gets minimal care. The older nurse's expression darkened. We've seen this before, you know. In the Cold War, military planners developed similar protocols for mass casualty situations if the Soviets invaded Western Europe. The difference is those were for apocalyptic scenarios, thousands of casualties overwhelming the system. She shook her head, this is turning normal operations into a calculation of human worth. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a medical corpsman breathless from running. Dr. Reynolds, incoming casualty, single patient, urgent surgical. In the trauma bay, a young soldier lay on the examination table, his right leg, a mangled mess of bone fragments and shredded muscle. The field dressing was soaked through with blood, and his face was gray with pain and shock. Private Henderson, 10th Mountain Division, reported the medic who'd brought him in. IED strike during patrol. BP's holding at a 160 pulse 110. He's had 2 units of blood and 10 of morphine in the field. Eleanor cut away what remained of his uniform pants, revealing the full extent of the damage. The blast had nearly severed the leg below the knee, leaving only a few tendons and blood vessels intact. Type and cross for 4 more units, she ordered. And prep the OR. We'll need to amputate. As the team moved efficiently around her, Eleanor became aware of a presence at the trauma bay door. Lieutenant Fletcher stood watching, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he turned and left without a word. 15 minutes later, as she was scrubbing for surgery, Dr. Abrams entered the prep room, his face grim. Eleanor, I just got a call from General Harrington's office. Private Henderson is to be classified as Category 3 under the new protocol. Minimal intervention only. Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. He needs an amputation or he'll die from blood loss and infection. I know that, Abrams said heavily, but according to Fletcher, an amputation requires too many resources for a soldier who won't be returning to combat duty. They're ordering palliative care only. The surgical brush fell from Eleanor's hand into the sink. That's a death sentence. I know, Abrams repeated, looking every one of his 52 years. I've requested a direct consultation with the general, but Fletcher says he's in meetings all morning. Eleanor's mind raced. Private Henderson was 19 according to his chart. The same age her brother would have been if he'd lived. The same age as countless young men. She'd treated some of whom now walked on prosthetic legs, finished college, got married, had children, all the things they'd have been denied if someone had decided they weren't worth the resources to save. How long do we have before someone checks on our compliance? She asked quietly. Abrams understood immediately what she was suggesting. His expression was torn between professional responsibility and moral revulsion at the order. Fletcher said he'd return at noon to verify implementation of the protocol. Eleanor checked her watch. It was 09:27. Then we have just over 2.5 hours. That's enough time. Eleanor, if you do this, I know the risks. She cut him off. But I also know what my father would have done, what any doctor worthy of the title would do. Abrams looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. I'll assist, and I'll take full responsibility if it comes to that. No, Eleanor said firmly. This is my decision. I won't let you sacrifice your career. The surgery took exactly 94 minutes. The amputation was clean, the arteries ligated with meticulous care, the nerve endings buried to minimize phantom pain later. They'd just finished closing when Sophia entered the OR. Fletcher's here, she said without preamble. Early, he wants to know why Private Henderson is in surgery when he was classified as Category 3. Eleanor looked up from the final dressing she was applying. Tell him Dr. Abrams and I will brief him as soon as we're finished here. After ensuring Henderson was stable in recovery, Eleanor and Abrams found Fletcher waiting in the hallway, his expression thunderous. You directly disobeyed a command order, he began without preamble. General Harrington was explicitly clear about Protocol Alpha 7. We made a medical decision based on the patient's condition, Eleanor replied steadily. Private Henderson would have died without intervention. Fletcher's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. The protocol exists precisely to make these difficult decisions, Doctor. By ignoring it, you've consumed resources that could have been allocated to higher priority patients. What higher priority patients? Eleanor challenged. The OR was available. We had blood on hand. No other urgent cases were waiting. That's not the point, Fletcher snapped. The point is the chain of command and your willful disregard for it. My chain of command includes the Hippocratic Oath, Eleanor said, keeping her voice level with effort. First, do no harm. Allowing a young man to die when we had the means to save him would have violated that oath. Fletcher's face flushed with anger. The general will hear about this. I'm counting on it, Eleanor replied. I'd like to explain my medical reasoning to him directly. As Fletcher stalked away, Abrams let out a long breath. You realize you've just painted a target on your back. Eleanor watched Fletcher's retreating form. Better me than my patients. The confrontation Eleanor expected didn't come that day, nor the next. Instead, something more insidious began. Supplies she requested were delayed. Equipment malfunctioned and took days to repair. Staff she needed were reassigned to other duties. It was a silent campaign of obstruction carefully calibrated to hinder without providing clear evidence of interference. 3 days after the amputation, Eleanor received a summons to General Harrington's office. She found him reviewing reports, the desk between them, a symbolic barricade. Dr. Reynolds, he began without looking up. Your surgical team consumed 18% more blood products last week than the baseline established by Protocol Alpha 7. We had 3 major traumas, sir, all priority cases. Now he looked up, his pale eyes calculating, including Private Henderson. A case that Lieutenant Fletcher informs me was specifically designated Category 3. Eleanor stood her ground. His injuries required immediate intervention to prevent death. That supersedes the protocol categorization. Harrington leaned back in his chair. You know what I find interesting? Doctor, your justifications sound remarkably like those your father used when questioned about his treatment decisions in Desert Storm. I'll take that as a compliment, sir. A muscle twitched in Harrington's jaw, the first crack in his composed facade. It wasn't intended as one. Your father's misplaced priorities cost American lives, lives that mattered. All lives matter in a hospital, General. That's the foundation of medical ethics. Ethics, Harrington repeated the word dripping with contempt. Let me tell you what your father's ethics cost. Captain Montgomery was hit by artillery shrapnel during the ground offensive. He needed urgent surgery, but the medical company had committed their resources to enemy wounded. By the time they could take him, he'd lost too much blood. He died on the operating table while your father worked frantically to save him too late because he'd chosen to save the enemy first. Eleanor absorbed this, trying to reconcile it with what she knew of her father. Sir, with respect, battlefield triage is complex. I wasn't there and neither were you. We can't know all the factors that influence those decisions. I know enough, Harrington said coldly, and I know I won't allow the same mistakes here. Protocol Alpha 7 will be followed. American lives, the lives of our warriors, come first. Is that understood? The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. This was the line in the sand. I understand your position, General, Eleanor said carefully, and I hope you understand mine. I took an oath to treat patients based on medical need, not military value. Harrington's expression hardened. Then we have a problem, Doctor, because I intend to enforce this protocol with or without your cooperation. That would be your prerogative, sir. Their eyes locked in silent confrontation, neither willing to yield. The standoff was broken by the sudden wail of the emergency siren, the signal for incoming casualties. We'll continue this discussion later, Harrington said dismissively. You're needed in the trauma bay. Eleanor hurried to the hospital, her mind racing. The situation was becoming untenable, but she couldn't see a way out that didn't compromise her principles or abandon her patients. The emergency proved to be a convoy of civilian casualties, Afghan villagers caught in crossfire between coalition forces and Taliban fighters. Among them was an elderly man with a severe chest wound who had once served as an interpreter for American forces. As Eleanor worked to stabilize him, the interpreter clutched her arm with surprising strength. Doctor, he gasped in accented English, I have information. Taliban planning attack. Must tell American commander. Before he could say more, his oxygen levels plummeted, requiring immediate intubation. Eleanor worked swiftly, aware that this patient now carried intelligence value in addition to his medical needs. She had just inserted the breathing tube when the trauma bay doors swung open and General Harrington entered, flanked by Lieutenant Fletcher and an intelligence officer. Report, Harrington demanded, surveying the chaotic scene of medical staff treating multiple civilian casualties. 6 locals with various injuries, Abrams replied. 2 critical, including a former interpreter with information about Taliban movements. Harrington's gaze swept over the civilians with undisguised impatience. I need that intelligence. Get the interpreter stabilized enough to talk. Eleanor looked up from the elderly man's chest where she was inserting a chest tube to reinflate his collapsed lung. Sir, he's in respiratory failure. He can't speak while intubated, and removing the tube would kill him. Then find another way, Harrington ordered. That information could save American lives. I'm trying to save his life first, Eleanor replied, focusing on the procedure. Once he's stable, your intelligence officer can communicate with him through writing. Harrington stepped closer, his voice dropping to ensure only Eleanor could hear. Doctor, in case I haven't made myself clear, these civilians are the lowest priority under Protocol Alpha 7. We have Americans with medical needs waiting. Eleanor glanced around the trauma bay. There were no other patients waiting, a fact Harrington surely knew. With respect, sir, there's no resource conflict at the moment. We have adequate staff and supplies to treat everyone currently presenting. The general's expression darkened. That wasn't a suggestion, Doctor. I want these civilians stabilized and transferred to the Afghan National Army Medical Facility immediately. Focus your resources on preparing the interpreter for interrogation. The ANA facility is 3 hours away by road, Eleanor protested. In their current condition, 2 of these patients won't survive the journey. That's unfortunate, Harrington said coldly, but my priority is the intelligence that could prevent the next attack on our forces. Eleanor straightened up, still holding the chest tube that was draining blood from the interpreter's pleural cavity. Sir, these civilians were injured by coalition fire. Under Article 10 of the Geneva Convention, we have an obligation to provide the same standard of care we would give our own personnel. Don't lecture me about the Geneva Convention, doctor. Harrington snapped loud enough that others in the trauma bay turned to look. I've spent my entire adult life fighting enemies who don't even recognize its existence. Then we should be different from them, Eleanor replied steadily. That's the point. For a moment, she thought Harrington might actually strike her. His face flushed dark red and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Instead, he leaned in until his face was inches from hers. You have 1 hour to stabilize these patients for transfer. After that, I'm ordering this facility cleared for incoming American casualties. Defy that order, and I'll have you relieved of duty and facing court-martial before sunset. Am I clear? Without waiting for an answer, he turned and strode from the trauma bay, leaving a wake of tense silence. Sophia moved to Eleanor's side, speaking quietly as they continued working. What are you going to do? Eleanor looked down at the elderly interpreter, whose life literally hung on the equipment and expertise available only in this facility. Then she glanced at the Afghan child in the next bay, no more than 7 years old with shrapnel wounds that would require surgery. The only thing I can do, she answered. My job. The hour Harrington had granted passed like a combat countdown. Eleanor and her team worked with practiced efficiency, stabilizing patients, while quietly preparing for the battle they knew was coming. No one spoke about what would happen when Harrington returned, but the tense determination on their faces told the story. These medical professionals had taken the same oath Eleanor had, an oath that made no distinction between friend and foe soldier in civilian. BP stable at 110/70, reported the medic monitoring the elderly interpreter. O2 sat climbing to 93%. Eleanor nodded, checking the chest tube drainage. Good. Keep him on the ventilator and continue broad-spectrum antibiotics. She turned to Sophia, lowering her voice. What's our supply situation? The older nurse's expression was grim but resolute. I've secured enough for emergency surgeries on both critical patients. Stored them in the auxiliary supply closet under training materials. Fletcher's people won't think to look there. And the surgical team, Gerald Abrams is officially off duty, but he's changing into scrubs as we speak. 2 surgical nurses have volunteered to stay. They understand the risks. Eleanor felt a swell of pride in your team. Not one had hesitated when she'd explained her intention to defy Harrington's orders. They were medical professionals, first soldiers, second, exactly as her father had taught her. The trauma bay doors swung open and Eleanor steeled herself for Harrington's entrance. Instead, it was Major Carter, the base intelligence officer. Unlike Fletcher, Carter was a career officer with combat experience who commanded respect rather than demanded it. Dr. Reynolds, he began without preamble. General Harrington is expecting these patients to be ready for transport. The 2 critical cases aren't stable enough to survive transport, Major, Eleanor replied frankly. Moving them would be a death sentence. Carter's expression remained professionally neutral, but his eyes conveyed understanding. The general was quite explicit in his orders, Doctor. He believes the Afghan National Army facility is adequately equipped. Then the general is either misinformed or deliberately ignoring medical reality. The ANA facility has no ventilators, no surgical capabilities, and limited blood supply. These patients require advanced trauma care that simply isn't available there. Carter glanced around the trauma bay, noting the intensive care being provided. His gaze lingered on the elderly interpreter. Is it true he has intelligence about an imminent attack? He indicated as much before we had to intubate him. Once he's stable, you can communicate with him in writing. The major considered this, clearly weighing competing priorities. The general is particularly interested in that intelligence, Doctor. If you could prioritize stabilizing that specific patient enough for questioning. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. I prioritize based on medical need, Major. Right now, both critical patients require equal attention. I won't sacrifice one for the other. Carter nodded, seemingly having expected this answer. I understand your position, Doctor, but you should know that General Harrington is preparing to issue a formal reprimand for insubordination. This could affect your career significantly. I'm aware of the potential consequences, Eleanor said quietly, but I can't in good conscience abandon these patients. As Carter turned to leave, he hesitated, then spoke in a lower voice. For what it's worth, Doctor, not everyone on this base agrees with the General's new protocols. Colonel Henderson implemented them reluctantly and with significant modifications. The implication was clear. Carter himself had reservations. It was a small comfort, but Eleanor would take any allies she could find. After Carter left, Sophia approached. The transport vehicles are waiting outside. Harrington's given them orders to depart in 15 minutes with or without all the patients. Eleanor made her decision. Move the 4 stable patients to transport. The 2 critical cases stay here. I'll take full responsibility. You won't be alone, Sophia assured her southern drawl more pronounced with emotion. Some of us old-timers remember when medicine came before politics. As they prepared the stable patients for transfer, Eleanor caught sight of Lieutenant Fletcher watching through the trauma bay window, his expression cold as he reported their movements via radio, presumably to Harrington. The lieutenant had positioned himself as the general's loyal enforcer, documenting every perceived infraction for later retribution. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. When the transport vehicles departed with only 4 patients instead of 6, Eleanor braced herself for the storm that would follow. It arrived minutes later in the form of General Harrington himself, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Dr. Reynolds," he began with dangerous calm, "I believe my orders were explicit." Eleanor stood her ground beside the ventilator, supporting the elderly interpreter's breathing. "These patients would die if transported, General. As a medical officer, I cannot ethically transfer patients who require life support to a facility without the capability to provide it." "Your ethical concerns have been noted, Doctor. However, this is a military installation operating under military command. My orders supersede your personal interpretations of medical ethics." "Not according to the Uniform Code of Military Justice," Eleanor countered. "Article 90 establishes that military personnel are not obligated to obey unlawful orders. Deliberately endangering civilian casualties, protected under the Geneva Convention, constitutes such an unlawful order." Harrington's eyes narrowed. "You're on dangerously thin ice, Doctor. I strongly suggest you reconsider your position before you damage your career beyond repair." "My career concerns me less than my patients' lives, sir." For a long moment they stared at each other in silent confrontation, the beeping of medical monitors providing an ironically steady backbeat to the tension. Finally, Harrington spoke with cold precision. "You have until 1800 hours to complete whatever procedures you deem essential and prepare these patients for transport. After that, I'm suspending your medical privileges at this facility, pending a formal review of your fitness for command. Lieutenant Fletcher will remain to ensure compliance." With that, he turned and strode from the trauma bay, leaving Fletcher behind as his watchdog. Eleanor didn't waste time dwelling on Harrington's threat. She had 6 hours to stabilize 2 critical patients and find a way to preserve their access to the care they needed. As she turned back to her work, she caught Sophia's eye. "I need to speak with Major Carter as soon as possible," she said quietly, "and find Dr. Abrams. We have surgeries to perform." The following hours were a blur of intense medical activity. Eleanor and Abrams operated simultaneously in the 2 available ORs, Abrams removing shrapnel from the Afghan child's abdomen, while Eleanor repaired the extensive damage to the interpreter's lung and chest wall. Lieutenant Fletcher stationed himself in the observation area, documenting every medication used, every unit of blood transfused, every supply consumed. By 1700 hours, both surgeries were complete. The patients had been moved to recovery, still critically ill, but with improved chances of survival if they continued to receive advanced care. As Eleanor updated the charts, Sophia approached with Major Carter in tow. "Doctor," Carter greeted her with a respectful nod, "I understand you wanted to see me." Eleanor led him to a quiet corner where Fletcher couldn't overhear. "Major, I need your help. The interpreter has regained consciousness. He can't speak with the breathing tube, but he's alert enough to communicate by writing." Carter's expression sharpened with interest. "What has he told you?" "Nothing yet. I wanted you present for any intelligence debriefing. But I need something in return." The intelligence officer raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "These patients need to remain here under our care. The interpreter in particular won't survive a transfer in his condition. I need you to convince General Harrington that the intelligence value outweighs his desire to enforce the protocol." Carter considered this, his expression thoughtful. "The general is particularly focused on force protection right now. If the intelligence is significant enough." He nodded decisively. I'll see what I can do. With Carter's assistance, they provided the interpreter with a notepad. His handwriting was shaky but legible, as he detailed Taliban preparations for an attack on a supply convoy scheduled for the following day. The route, the timing, the number of fighters involved all vital intelligence that could save American lives. Carter read the information with growing urgency. This is specific and actionable. Excuse me, doctor. I need to get this to command immediately. As he hurried away, Eleanor allowed herself a small hope that the intelligence might provide leverage to protect her patients. That hope was short-lived. Less than 30 minutes later, Fletcher approached her with smug satisfaction. General Harrington thanks you for facilitating the intelligence gathering, Doctor. The transport for these remaining patients will arrive at 1800 hours as planned. He expects full compliance. Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. That interpreter just provided information that could save American lives, and this is how the general repays him, by sending him to a facility where he'll likely die. The general believes in proper resource allocation, Fletcher replied stiffly. Now that the intelligence has been secured, these patients no longer represent strategic value to the base. The cold calculation in his voice made Eleanor's blood boil. These are human beings, Lieutenant, not resources to be exploited and discarded. Fletcher's expression remained unmoved. You have 20 minutes, Doctor. I suggest you use it to prepare your patients for transport rather than arguing about policies you can't change. As he walked away, Eleanor fought to control her rising anger. This wasn't just about medical ethics anymore. It was about basic humanity. She couldn't allow Harrington to treat people as disposable assets once their usefulness ended. Sophia appeared at her side, her face tight with concern. What are we going to do? Eleanor's mind raced through options, each more desperate than the last. I need to speak with Dr. Abrams and Major Carter again, and find Sergeant Roberts. Sergeant Major Michael Roberts was the highest-ranking non-commissioned officer on the base. At 58, he was a veteran of the Cold War-era Desert Storm and multiple deployments to Afghanistan. More importantly, he was respected by everyone from privates to colonels for his impeccable integrity and encyclopedic knowledge of military regulations. Eleanor found him in the mess hall, his weathered face creased with concern, when she explained the situation. The general's walking a fine line, Roberts acknowledged, his gravelly voice kept low. Protocol Alpha 7 hasn't been fully vetted by JAG Corps. Implementing it against medical objections creates potential liability issues. Can you help me find a regulatory basis to keep these patients here? Eleanor asked. Or at least delay the transfer until they're truly stable. Roberts considered this decades of experience evident in his thoughtful expression. There's Article 419 of the Theater Medical Operations Guidelines. It grants the senior medical officer authority to override transport orders if, in their professional judgment, transport would cause immediate and significant deterioration in patient condition. Eleanor felt a surge of hope. That's exactly what we're facing. But Harrington's threatening to suspend my medical privileges. He can't do that unilaterally, Robert said firmly, not without a formal review board. Until such a board convenes and rules, you remain the Deputy Chief Medical Officer with all associated authority. This was the procedural lifeline Eleanor needed. Thank you, Sergeant Major. I may need you to document this conversation later. I stand by regulations, Dr. Roberts replied simply. Always have, always will. Armed with this information, Eleanor returned to the hospital to find an unexpected ally. Major Carter was examining the interpreter's latest vital signs, his brow furrowed in concentration. Major, she greeted him with surprise. I thought you'd be briefing the general on the intelligence we gathered. I already have, Carter replied. Now I'm concerned about the source of that intelligence. This man worked with American forces for over 5 years. He risked his life and his family's safety to help us. I'm not comfortable with shipping him off to after we've extracted what we needed from him. Eleanor felt a surge of relief at finding another officer with a conscience. I've identified a regulatory basis to keep him here under Article 419 of TMOG, but Harrington will fight it. Carter's expression hardened with resolve. Then we'll need to build a coalition. Dr. Abrams agrees with your medical assessment, I assume? Completely. He's documenting the medical contraindications to transport now. Good. With the Chief Medical Officer, the Intelligence Section, and the Command Sergeant Major all in agreement, the General will have a harder time dismissing this as one doctor's insubordination. The alliance forming gave Eleanor hope, but she knew Harrington wouldn't back down easily. He had made this confrontation personal, a test of wills rooted in old grievances that went beyond protocols and regulations. As 1800 hours approached, Eleanor stationed herself between her patients and the trauma bay doors, the written citation of Article 419 in hand. Sophia and two nurses stood with her, a silent wall of medical protection. The doors swung open precisely on time, revealing Lieutenant Fletcher leading two medical transport technicians with stretchers. His expression darkened when he saw the impromptu barricade. Reynolds, these patients are being transferred by direct order of General Harrington. Eleanor held up the document. Under Article 419 of the Theater Medical Operations Guidelines, I am exercising my authority as a medical officer to countermand that transport order. In my professional judgment, moving these patients would cause immediate and significant deterioration in their condition, likely resulting in death. Fletcher's face flushed with anger. This is blatant insubordination. The general will need to follow proper procedures, interrupted Dr. Abrams, appearing behind Eleanor with his own documentation. As Chief Medical Officer, I concur with Dr. Reynolds' assessment and support her invocation of Article 419. Fletcher looked from one doctor to the other momentarily at a loss. This was no longer one rebellious officer, but a unified medical position. I need to inform the general, he said finally, backing toward the door. Please do, Eleanor replied calmly, and inform him that my full medical rationale has been documented and witnessed by multiple officers. If he wishes to challenge it, he'll need to convene a formal medical review board. After Fletcher's departure, the trauma bay fell into tense silence. Everyone present knew this was merely a pause in the battle, not a victory. Harrington wouldn't accept this challenge to his authority without retaliation. They didn't have to wait long. Within 15 minutes, the base speaker system crackled to life. Dr. Eleanor Reynolds, report to the commanding officer's office immediately. Eleanor exchanged glances with Abrams. Keep them safe, she said quietly before squaring her shoulders and heading for the confrontation she knew awaited her. Harrington's office was aggressively Spartan, the walls now adorned with tactical maps and his impressive collection of medals and citations, visual reminders of his authority and accomplishments. The general himself stood behind his desk, hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid with contained fury. Lieutenant Fletcher stood to one side, notepad ready to document whatever transpired. Harrington began, his voice Arctic cold. You continue to test the limits of military discipline. Article 419 is intended for emergency situations where no suitable medical alternatives exist, not as a tool to undermine command decisions. With respect, sir, that's exactly the situation we're facing, Eleanor replied steadily. The Afghan National Army facility lacks the equipment and expertise these patients require. Transport there would effectively constitute a death sentence. That is your opinion, Doctor. Others disagree. Medical facts aren't matters of opinion, General. They're reality. These patients require ventilator support, advanced monitoring, and skilled nursing care, none of which are available at the ANA facility. Harrington's jaw tightened. You've made your position clear through your actions, Doctor. Now let me make mine equally clear. Your continued defiance threatens the discipline and cohesion of this command. I cannot and will not allow it to continue. He slid a document across the desk. This is a formal reprimand for insubordination. It will be entered into your permanent service record. Consider it your final warning. Eleanor didn't touch the paper. Sir, I understand your commitment to the chain of command. But military discipline isn't an end in itself. It's a means to accomplish our mission. And part of that mission includes providing medical care in accordance with international law and our own ethical standards. Don't presume to lecture me about our mission, Doctor. Harrington snapped his composure, cracking slightly. I've spent 30 years defending this country while you were in medical school learning theories from professors who've never heard a shot fired in anger. I'm not questioning your service or your commitment, General, but in this specific instance, I believe you're allowing personal feelings to cloud your judgment. The room went deadly quiet. Fletcher's pen stopped moving as he looked up in shock at Eleanor's directness. Harrington's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Explain yourself, Doctor. Eleanor knew she was crossing a line, but there was no turning back now. You told me yourself that you lost a friend in Desert Storm because medical resources were diverted to enemy wounded. You believe my father was responsible for that loss. Now you're implementing a protocol that prioritizes certain lives over others, and you've targeted me specifically for enforcement. You think this is personal? Harrington's pale eyes blazed with cold fire. This is about military effectiveness. Every resource we waste on civilians or fatally wounded soldiers is unavailable for the warriors who can return to the fight. If it's not personal, sir, then why am I the only medical officer facing a formal reprimand? Dr. Abrams supported my invocation of Article 419, yet he wasn't summoned here. Harrington didn't answer directly, instead changing tactics. Your father was an excellent surgeon, Dr. Reynolds. No one disputed that. What some of us questioned was his judgment about resource allocation in a combat zone. His voice softened slightly, becoming almost reflective. He treated a critically wounded Republican Guard officer who'd been commanding a unit that had killed Americans hours earlier. Captain Montgomery, meanwhile, waited for surgery until it was too late. I understand that must have been devastating for you, Eleanor said, her own tone softening. Losing a friend is always tragic, especially in war. But my father believed, as I do, that medical care isn't a reward for being on the right side. It's a human right. For a brief moment, something flashed across Harrington's face, pain perhaps, or a flicker of understanding. Then it was gone, replaced by the stern mask of command. Your reprimand stands, Doctor. I expect full compliance with my orders going forward. Dismissed. As Eleanor left the office, she felt strangely calm despite the confrontation. She had looked into the eyes of the man who seemed determined to end her career, and seen not just anger but pain, the lingering wound of a decades-old loss that had never fully healed. Understanding her adversary better didn't make him less dangerous, but it did make him more human. The following days brought a precarious stalemate. Eleanor continued treating her critical patients, who slowly improved under the advanced care only available at FOB Horizon. Harrington, meanwhile, implemented Protocol Alpha 7 throughout the rest of the medical operation, requiring Eleanor to carefully document medical necessity for every procedure that deviated from its priorities. Eleanor found unexpected allies in the shadow war of paperwork and regulations. Major Carter ensured the interpreter's continued presence was justified by ongoing intelligence value. Sergeant Major Roberts discreetly advised her on navigating military bureaucracy to protect both her patients and her career. Even Colonel Peterson, the base executive officer, began scrutinizing Harrington's more extreme implementations of the protocol call, requiring written justification for decisions that might create liability issues. The alliance wasn't just about protecting patients, it was about preserving the soul of military medicine itself. Each of these veterans in their own way understood that compassion wasn't weakness, but strength, that treating the wounded with dignity reflected the values they had sworn to defend. One afternoon, as Eleanor completed her rounds, Sophia pulled her aside. You should know that Fletcher's been questioning staff about your father, specifically about his service in Desert Storm. Eleanor frowned. What exactly is he looking for? Not sure, but he seems particularly interested in any connection between your father and General Harrington before the current situation. Asked if you ever mentioned family stories about Desert Storm. This was an unexpected development. I need to talk to Roberts again. If Fletcher's digging into the past, there's something we're missing. She found the sergeant major in his office maps of the region spread across his desk as he planned patrol routes. His weathered face creased with concern as she explained Fletcher's inquiries. That's interesting timing, Roberts said thoughtfully, especially since personnel records from Desert Storm would be archived and not easily accessible from a forward operating base. Unless someone had a reason to pull those records before deployment, Eleanor suggested. Could Harrington have known I'd be stationed here when he took command? Roberts nodded slowly. Officer assignments are determined months in advance. If the general requested your service record, he would have seen your deployment schedule. The implications settled heavily between them. This wasn't coincidence, Eleanor said quietly. Harrington specifically sought command of this FO knowing I was stationed here. That would suggest a level of premeditation that goes beyond professional concern about medical protocols. Roberts agreed. The question is why? What does he hope to accomplish by confronting you specifically? Revenge for my father's perceived role in his friend's death, Eleanor suggested, or some kind of test to see if I'll make the same decisions my father did. Maybe both, Roberts said grimly. Either way, it makes this situation more volatile. A commander with a personal vendetta is unpredictable. Eleanor thought about the cold fury in Harrington's eyes when she'd suggested his judgment was compromised by personal feelings. I need to learn more about what happened in Desert Storm, the specific incident involving my father, Captain Montgomery, and the Iraqi officer. That won't be easy from here, Roberts cautioned, but I know some veterans from that conflict who might remember. I'll make some discreet inquiries. As Eleanor turned to leave, Roberts added, "Watch yourself, Doctor. If the general has made this personal, he won't back down easily. Men like Harrington see retreat as failure, even when advancing means going over a cliff." The warning proved prophetic. That evening, as Eleanor worked in the hospital, Lieutenant Fletcher appeared with a new written order effective immediately. All Category 3 patients under Protocol Alpha 7 were to be transferred to the ANA facility within 24 hours, no exceptions. The order specifically nullified any invocation of Article 419 without direct approval from General Harrington himself. Eleanor stared at the document in disbelief. This contradicts established medical regulations. He can't simply override theater medical operations guidelines by fiat. The general anticipated your objection, Fletcher replied with evident satisfaction. He's invoked emergency command authority under Article 7 of the Combat Zone Operational Directives. In essence, he's declaring that the medical resources currently allocated to Category 3 patients constitute a critical shortage affecting combat readiness. That's absurd, Eleanor protested. We're at 70% capacity. There is no resource shortage. Fletcher's smile was thin. Nevertheless, the order stands. You have until 1800 hours tomorrow to prepare all Category 3 patients for transfer. After he left, Eleanor sought out Dr. Abrams, finding him in the small office they shared. The older doctor read the order with growing alarm. "This is dangerous overreach," he said finally. "Emergency command authority is meant for genuine crisis situations, mass casualties, base under attack, critical supply shortages. Using it to enforce a disputed protocol sets a terrible precedent." "Can we fight it?" Eleanor asked. Abrams sighed heavily. "Not quickly enough to help our current patients. Emergency command authority can only be countermanded by higher headquarters, and that process takes days, sometimes weeks." Eleanor felt a cold knot of dread forming in her stomach. "So we have no choice but to transfer patients who will likely die as a result." "Legally speaking, our options are limited," Abrams admitted. "But," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully, "there may be alternatives worth considering, particularly for our most critical cases." Eleanor understood the implication. "You're suggesting we find a way to transfer them somewhere other than the ANA facility?" "I'm not suggesting anything specific," Abrams replied cautiously. "I'm simply noting that the order specifies transfer to the ANA facility for Category 3 patients. If a patient's condition were to change requiring a higher level of care than even we can provide here, they might need evacuation to Bagram or Landstuhl instead." Eleanor finished the thought. "But Harrington would never approve such transfers without clear medical justification." "True," Abrams agreed, "but sometimes patients develop unexpected complications requiring specialized intervention." The ethical implications were troubling. Creating false medical emergencies violated Eleanor's professional integrity. Yet allowing patients to die when alternatives existed violated her most fundamental oath. "I need time to think," she said finally. The weight of the decision kept Eleanor awake most of the night. By morning, she had reached the difficult conclusion that she couldn't manufacture medical emergencies even to save lives. Her integrity as a physician had to remain intact, or everything she fought for lost meaning. Instead, she focused on making the genuine medical case for each patient, documenting in extensive detail why the ANA facility was inadequate for their needs. If Harrington insisted on transfers, the paper trail would clearly establish that he had been fully informed of the likely fatal consequences. She was completing this documentation when the trauma alert siren wailed across the base. Eleanor rushed to the trauma bay, where Sophia was already organizing the emergency response team. "What's coming in?" Eleanor asked, pulling on trauma gloves. "Multiple casualties," Sophia replied grimly. "Special operations team ambushed during recon. 2 critical, 4 walking wounded. First helicopter landing in 3 minutes." The familiar surge of adrenaline pushed all other concerns aside as Eleanor prepared to receive the wounded. This was what she had trained for, the moments when skill, speed, and decisiveness made the difference between life and death. The first helicopter touched down with a roar, rotors whipping dust into blinding clouds. Medics rushed forward with stretchers as the crew chief directed the unloading of casualties. Eleanor focused on the first critical patient brought into the trauma bay, a special forces operative with multiple gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen. Blood soaked the hasty field dressings, and his skin had the gray pallor of severe shock. "Type and cross for 6 units," she ordered, cutting away his body armor to access the wounds. "Get ultrasound in here and prepare the OR. We need to stop this bleeding now." As she worked to stabilize the operator, Eleanor became aware of commotion from the second trauma bay. Glancing over, she saw Dr. Abrams working frantically on another casualty, this one in the distinctive uniform of Harrington's personal security detail. With a shock of recognition, Eleanor realized the second critical patient was Lieutenant Fletcher. The lieutenant's face was ashen, his body limp as Abrams performed CPR. "What happened?" she called across to the second team. "Multiple GSWs to the chest and abdomen," a medic replied without looking up from attaching monitoring leads. He was the general's personal escort on a forward observation mission. Taliban ambushed them with heavy weapons. Eleanor's mind raced with the implications. Fletcher, Harrington's right hand and enforcer, was fighting for his life in the same facility where he'd been documenting violations of the general's protocols just hours earlier. Before she could process this further, the trauma bay doors burst open again. General Harrington strode in his uniform, dust-covered and torn at one sleeve where a bullet had apparently grazed him. His face was a mask of controlled fury as he surveyed the medical teams working on the casualties. His gaze locked first on Fletcher's still form, then shifted to Eleanor and the Special Forces operative she was treating. For a moment, no one spoke as the beeping of monitors and the controlled urgency of medical orders filled the space between them. Then Harrington's voice cut through it all with cold precision. "Dr. Reynolds, I need you to transfer immediately to Lieutenant Fletcher's care. He requires priority treatment." Eleanor's hands continued working, applying pressure to a bleeding artery as she replied without looking up. "Sir, I'm currently stopping a life-threatening hemorrhage. Dr. Abrams is fully capable of treating Lieutenant Fletcher." "That wasn't a request," Dr. Harrington snapped. "Fletcher's wounds require your specific expertise. The operator can be stabilized by another physician." Now Eleanor did look up, meeting Harrington's ice-blue stare across the trauma bay. "General, both patients are critical. Both require immediate intervention. I'm already engaged in a life-saving procedure that cannot be interrupted without risking this man's life. The lieutenant is my aide and a valuable intelligence asset." Harrington's voice dropped dangerously. "His strategic value to this command classifies him as Category 1 under Protocol Alpha 7, requiring priority treatment from our most skilled surgeon." The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor or anyone else in the trauma bay. The same protocol that Harrington had been using to deny care to lower priority patients was now being invoked to demand preferential treatment for his own man. "I understand, sir," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the tension coursing through her. "But medical triage is based on clinical factors, not rank or strategic value. Both patients are Category 1 under any protocol. Both will receive the highest level of care we can provide." The trauma bay fell silent except for the urgent work of the medical teams and the rhythmic beeping of monitors. Every person present understood they were witnessing a pivotal confrontation, one that transcended the immediate crisis to touch on fundamental questions about military medicine itself. Harrington's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "Dr. Reynolds, this is my final warning. Transfer your care to Lieutenant Fletcher immediately or face court-martial for direct insubordination during a combat operation." Eleanor's hands never paused in their life-saving work as she replied with quiet certainty, "I cannot in good conscience abandon this patient mid-procedure, sir. That would violate every principle of medical ethics and likely result in his death." The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited for Harrington's response. The general's face flushed dark with rage, his control visibly slipping for the first time since taking command. What happened next would shock everyone present and forever change the dynamics of Phobie Horizon. In a swift, fluid motion born of decades of military training, General Victor Harrington unholstered his sidearm an M9 Beretta, and fired 5 rounds into the ceiling of the trauma bay. The gunshots were deafening in the enclosed space. Plaster dust rained down as the medical staff froze in stunned disbelief. Several dropped to the floor, conditioned by combat experience to seek cover when bullets flew. Only Eleanor remained perfectly still, her hands maintaining pressure on the wounded soldier's artery, her eyes never leaving her patient despite the sudden violence. When the echoes faded, Harrington spoke with unnatural calm, his pistol now lowered but still in his hand. Now that I have everyone's attention, let me be absolutely clear: in a combat zone, my orders will be followed without question or hesitation. The chain of command exists for a reason, and no one, regardless of their medical credentials, is exempt from it. Eleanor finally looked up from her patient, meeting Harrington's gaze across the suddenly silent trauma bay. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a quiet authority that contrasted sharply with the general's explosive display. Sir, you just discharged a weapon inside a medical facility filled with critically wounded personnel. That action has endangered patients and violated multiple regulations regarding weapon safety. I respectfully suggest you holster your weapon and allow this medical team to continue saving lives, all lives, as we are trained to do. The reality of what he had done seemed to dawn slowly on Harrington. His eyes moved from Eleanor to the shocked faces of the medical staff, then to the weapon still gripped in his hand. Several of the security personnel had their own hands hovering near their sidearms, unsure if they were witnessing a threat or a breakdown by their commanding officer. Before Harrington could respond, Sergeant Major Roberts appeared in the doorway, his weathered face a study in controlled alarm. The senior NCO took in the situation with a veteran's practiced eye: the discharged weapon, the plaster dust drifting down from the bullet holes, the frozen tableau of medical staff and their vulnerable patients. General, he said with the particular calm that only decades of battlefield experience can produce, I believe your presence is urgently required at the Tactical Operations Center. Intelligence is coming in about the ambush team's location and potential follow-up attacks. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man, a chance for Harrington to exit a situation that had spiraled beyond his control. For a moment it seemed he might refuse, might escalate further into territory from which there would be no return. Then military discipline reasserted itself. Harrington holstered his weapon with mechanical precision, his face once again an expressionless mask. Carry on, Dr. Reynolds, he said as if the past minutes had never happened. I expect a full report on both patients' conditions within the hour. As Harrington left with Roberts, the trauma bay erupted into renewed activity. Medical staff, who had ducked for cover, returned to their stations. Monitors that had been knocked askew were repositioned. The life-saving work resumed its urgent rhythm. But something fundamental had changed. A line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. By firing his weapon inside a medical facility, an act that violated the most basic principles of military discipline, Harrington had undermined his own authority more thoroughly than any challenge from Eleanor ever could. As she returned her full attention to saving the wounded operator before her, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that the confrontation had entered a new and dangerous phase. Harrington had revealed how far he was willing to go to enforce his will. The question now was who would hold him accountable for crossing that line and what price she might pay for standing her ground. The sound of gunfire in a medical facility changes everything. In the shocked silence that followed Harrington's departure, Eleanor kept working her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The Special Forces operator on her table needed her full attention, his life hanging in the balance while bullet holes scarred the ceiling above. BP stabilizing at 160, reported the medic monitoring vitals, pulse coming down to 110. Eleanor nodded without looking up. Prepare to move him to OR1. We need to get that bleeding under control surgically. Across the trauma bay, Dr. Abrams worked with equal intensity on Lieutenant Fletcher. The lieutenant's condition remained critical, his chances uncertain. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The man who had been documenting violations of Protocol Alpha 7 was now benefiting from the very medical resources he'd sought to restrict from others. Sophia appeared at Eleanor's side, her normally composed face tight with tension. We've got both ORs prepped and ready, but you should know there's already talk about what happened. The general firing his weapon. She lowered her voice further. Some of the security team are saying they've never seen anything like it, even in combat zones. Focus on the patients first, Eleanor replied quietly. The rest will have to wait. But even as she spoke, Eleanor understood that nothing would be the same after this incident. Harrington had crossed a line that no commanding officer could step back from. The only question was, what would happen next and who would bear the consequences? The next 6 hours passed in a blur of surgical intensity. Eleanor operated on the Special Forces soldier, repairing multiple arterial tears and removing bullet fragments from his abdomen and chest. In the adjacent operating room, Abrams fought to save Fletcher, whose injuries had proven even more extensive than initially assessed. When Eleanor finally emerged from surgery, exhausted but satisfied that her patient would survive, she found Sergeant Major Roberts waiting outside the OR. "Doctor," he greeted her, his weathered face grave. "We need to talk, privately." They moved to the small conference room adjacent to the recovery ward, where Roberts closed the door behind them. For a moment, the veteran NCO seemed to gather his thoughts, as if carefully considering his words. "What the general did in that trauma bay was inexcusable," he finally said. "Discharging a weapon inside a medical facility violates multiple regulations and endangered both patients and staff. It cannot go unreported." Eleanor nodded wearily. "I know. But reporting it means going up against a general officer who's already demonstrated he's willing to go to extreme lengths to enforce his authority." "Which is precisely why it must be reported," Roberts countered. "A commander who loses control to that degree is a danger to the entire command. I've seen it before officers who crack under the pressure and take increasingly erratic actions to maintain their position." "You think this will escalate?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. "Without question, the general has backed himself into a corner. If this incident becomes officially known to higher command, his career is effectively over. He knows that, which makes him more dangerous, not less." Eleanor considered this sobering assessment. "What are you suggesting we do?" "I've already begun gathering statements from witnesses," Roberts explained. "Neutral, factual accounts of what they observed without editorial comment. I've also pulled the security camera footage before it can conveniently malfunction." Eleanor raised an eyebrow at this initiative. "That's thorough. In 30 years of service, I've learned that truth needs proper documentation, especially when powerful interests might prefer it remain obscured." Robert's expression was grim determination personified. "General Harrington has friends at Central Command. This won't be a simple matter of filing a report and waiting for justice." "So what's our next step?" "Colonel Lawrence from Regional Command is scheduled to inspect FOB Horizon next week. He's an old-school officer who takes the Uniform Code of Military Justice seriously. We document everything until then and present it to him directly." Eleanor nodded, seeing the wisdom in this approach. "And in the meantime," Roberts said with a hint of gallows humor, "we watch each other's backs and do our jobs. The general will be looking for any excuse to discredit potential witnesses before they can testify against him." As if summoned by their discussion, there was a sharp knock on the door. Major Carter entered, his expression uncharacteristically tense. "Dr. Reynolds," he began without preamble, "the general is ordering you to report to his office at 0600 tomorrow. He's specified that this meeting is to discuss your ongoing pattern of insubordination and today's deliberate violation of Protocol Alpha 7. Eleanor exchanged glances with Roberts. This was Harrington moving to seize control of the narrative, to position himself as the aggrieved commander dealing with a problematic officer rather than as the man who had fired a weapon in a medical facility. "Understood, Major. Thank you for the message." Carter hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "I've also received orders to compile all intelligence gathered from the interpreter patient. The general seems particularly interested in establishing that the intelligence value has been exhausted, presumably, to justify transferring him to the ANA facility." Another move in Harrington's strategic repositioning, eliminating potential complications before they could be used against him. The interpreter, after all, had witnessed Eleanor's defense of medical ethics against military expediency. If transferred, his testimony would be conveniently unavailable. "The interpreter's condition is still too unstable for transfer," Eleanor said firmly. "And he's indicated he has additional information about Taliban movements that needs further debriefing." Carter nodded slightly, acknowledging the medical justification for keeping the interpreter present. "I'll note that in my report. And Doctor," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "not everyone on this base shares the general's interpretation of Protocol Alpha 7. Remember that?" After Carter left, Roberts looked thoughtfully at the closed door. You're gathering allies, Doctor. That's good. You'll need them. I never wanted this to become a faction fight, Eleanor said wearily. This should be about medical ethics and proper treatment of patients, not about taking sides. In a perfect world, perhaps, Roberts agreed. But in this one right and wrong often require champions willing to stand up and be counted. You've become that champion whether you intended to or not. The rest of the day passed intense preparation. Eleanor checked on her post-operative patients, including the Special Forces operator, who was stabilizing nicely, and Lieutenant Fletcher, whose condition remained critical, but had improved slightly under Abrams' skilled care. She also spent time with the Afghan interpreter and the child who had been at the center of the previous confrontation. Both were recovering well and living proof that her stand against Harrington's protocols had saved lives that would otherwise have been sacrificed to his rigid calculus of military value. As evening fell, Eleanor tried to rest in preparation for the morning's confrontation, but sleep proved elusive. Her mind kept replaying the moment of Harrington firing his weapon, the shock on everyone's faces, the plaster dust drifting down the sudden silence, followed by the general's cold voice. It was a pivotal moment that crystallized everything wrong with his approach to command. At 05:30, Eleanor rose and donned her service uniform, taking particular care with every detail. Today would be a day of reckoning one way or another. She wanted to face it with the same professionalism and dignity that had guided her medical career. As she walked through the pre-dawn darkness toward Harrington's headquarters, Eleanor was surprised to see several figures waiting outside. Abrams stood there along with Sophia Major Carter and Sergeant Major Roberts. Their presence was a silent statement of solidarity and support. "We thought you might appreciate some company," Abrams said simply. Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, all of you." Roberts checked his watch. "It's almost 0600. Shall we proceed, Doctor?" To Eleanor's surprise, the group moved to accompany her into the building. "You're all coming in. The general didn't specify that you should come alone," Roberts pointed out with a slight smile. "And as it happens, we all have legitimate business with command this morning." Inside, they found Lieutenant Fletcher's replacement, a nervous young officer named Martinez, stationed outside Harrington's door. He looked distinctly uncomfortable at the arrival of the impromptu delegation. "Dr. Reynolds," he stammered, "the general is expecting you, alone." "These officers have official business with command," Eleanor replied calmly. "Is the general available to see them as well?" Before Martinez could respond, the door opened to reveal Harrington himself. The general looked as if he had slept no better than Eleanor. His eyes shadowed his normally immaculate uniform, showing signs of hasty preparation. He surveyed the assembled group with barely concealed irritation. "This is an unusual way to report for a direct order doctor," he said coldly. Sir Roberts stepped forward. "We're here to formally report a serious breach of regulations that occurred in the medical facility yesterday." Harrington's eyes narrowed. "Any such reports should go through proper channels, Sergeant Major. This meeting is between myself and Dr. Reynolds regarding her ongoing insubordination." "With respect, sir," Roberts continued undeterred, "the incident in question directly involves command authority and requires immediate attention under Article 1382 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The mention of the UCMJ, specifically the article concerning conduct unbecoming an officer, hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet." Harrington's face darkened as he recognized the implicit accusation. "This is neither the time nor the place," he began, but was interrupted by a new arrival. "Perhaps I can be of assistance," came an authoritative voice from the hallway. Everyone turned to see Colonel James Lawrence, the regional command inspector, whose visit wasn't expected for several more days. The colonel was a tall, distinguished officer in his early 60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had seen everything the military could throw at a person and remained unshaken. "Colonel Lawrence," Harrington recovered quickly, snapping to attention. "We weren't expecting your inspection until next week." "Circumstances accelerated my schedule, General," Lawrence replied cryptically. "I received some concerning reports that warranted immediate investigation." His gaze swept over the assembled group. "It seems I've arrived at an opportune moment." Lawrence turned to Roberts. "Sergeant Major, you were about to report an incident under Article 1382. Roberts nodded. "Yes, sir. Yesterday at approximately 1400 hours, General Harrington discharged his sidearm 5 times inside the medical facility trauma bay during ongoing emergency treatment of wounded personnel." Lawrence's expression remained professional, but his eyes sharpened. Those are serious allegations, Sergeant Major. I assume you have documentation. Yes, sir. Written statements from 12 witnesses, security camera footage, and physical evidence in the form of bullet holes in the trauma bay ceiling and recovered shell casings. Harrington's composure slipped visibly. Colonel, these officers are attempting to misconstrue a necessary demonstration of command authority during a crisis situation. Lawrence regarded him steadily. Firing a weapon inside a medical facility is a demonstration of authority, General. That's an unusual interpretation of command prerogative. The context is crucial, Harrington insisted. Dr. Reynolds was openly defying direct orders regarding triage priorities during a mass casualty situation. Lives were at stake. 2 lives, Eleanor clarified quietly. Both critical, both receiving appropriate medical care based on standard triage protocols. Lawrence turned to her. You're Dr. Reynolds. Yes, sir. And you were treating one of the casualties when this incident occurred. Yes, sir. A special forces operator with multiple gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen. Dr. Abrams was simultaneously treating Lieutenant Fletcher General Harrington's aide, who had similar injuries. Lawrence nodded, absorbing this. And the general ordered you to abandon my current patient mid-procedure and transfer to the Lieutenant Fletcher's care instead, sir. He cited Protocol Alpha 7, which prioritizes patients based on rank and strategic value rather than medical necessity. The colonel's eyebrows rose slightly. Protocol Alpha 7, that's still in draft form at Central Command. It hasn't been approved for field implementation. General Harrington implemented it fully upon taking command, sir, Dr. Abrams interjected, despite numerous objections from the medical staff regarding ethical and legal concerns. Lawrence turned back to Harrington, his expression now grave. General, I think we need to continue this discussion in private. The rest of you are dismissed for now, but remain available for further questioning. As the group filed out, Lawrence added, Dr. Reynolds, please wait outside. I'll want to speak with you next. The corridor outside Harrington's office became an impromptu waiting room as Eleanor and her colleagues processed what had just happened. The unexpected arrival of Colonel Lawrence had changed the dynamic, completely shifting the power balance away from Harrington and toward official accountability. That was fortunate timing, Sophia observed quietly. Robert shook his head slightly. Not fortune. I contacted Regional Command yesterday immediately after the incident. Lawrence has a reputation for addressing potential command problems before they escalate. Eleanor looked at him with new appreciation for his foresight. Thank you for that. Just doing my job, Doctor. Protecting the troops sometimes means protecting them from their own leadership. Inside Harrington's office, voices occasionally rose high enough to be heard through the door, Lawrence's measured tone contrasting with Harrington's increasingly defensive responses. After approximately 20 minutes, the door opened and Lawrence beckoned to Eleanor. Dr. Reynolds, please join us. Inside, Harrington stood by the window, his back rigidly straight, his expression tightly controlled. Lawrence gestured for Eleanor to sit in the chair facing the desk, while he took Harrington's usual position of authority. Dr. Reynolds, Lawrence began, I've reviewed the preliminary information about yesterday's incident and General Harrington's implementation of Protocol Alpha 7. I'd like to hear directly from you about the medical implications of this protocol and the specific events leading to yesterday's confrontation. Eleanor provided a clear factual account, beginning with Harrington's initial implementation of the protocol, continuing through her efforts to maintain ethical medical standards despite increasing pressure, and concluding with the dramatic confrontation in the trauma bay. Throughout her explanation, Harrington remained silent by the window, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on a distant point outside. When she finished, Lawrence nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, Doctor. That matches the accounts provided by other witnesses. Now, regarding Protocol Alpha 7, in your professional medical opinion, what would be the consequences of its full implementation as General Harrington has ordered? Patients would die unnecessarily, sir, Eleanor answered without hesitation. The protocol prioritizes rank and perceives strategic value over medical need. In practice, this means critically wounded personnel deemed unlikely to return to combat would receive minimal care, while less severely wounded, higher-ranking personnel would receive priority treatment. And this contradicts established medical ethics. It contradicts the fundamental principle of triage, treating patients based on medical necessity rather than external factors. It also potentially violates the Geneva Conventions, which require equal treatment of all wounded, regardless of nationality, rank, or status. Lawrence turned to Harrington. General, do you have any response to Dr. Reynolds' assessment? Harrington finally turned from the window, his pale eyes cold. Dr. Reynolds consistently fails to recognize the military necessity behind Protocol Alpha 7. In a combat environment with limited resources, difficult choices must be made. The protocol simply formalizes those choices in a way that maximizes combat effectiveness. Even if it means letting salvageable patients die, Lawrence asked directly. War requires sacrifice, Harrington replied stiffly. Every commander knows this. Some personnel are more vital to the mission than others. That's not heartless, it's reality. Lawrence studied him for a long moment. General Harrington, I've reviewed your service record. 30 years of distinguished service, multiple combat deployments, decorations for valor. You've demonstrated exceptional commitment to this country and its military. Harrington's expression eased slightly at this apparent validation. However, Lawrence continued, his tone hardening, nothing in that record justifies discharging a weapon in a medical facility or implementing an unapproved protocol that contradicts both military medical regulations and international law. The colonel stood, his authority filling the room. Based on the evidence presented in my preliminary investigation, I am temporarily relieving you of command, pending a full review by the Inspector General's office. You will remain on base, but are restricted from the medical facility and from issuing any further orders regarding medical operations. Harrington's face flushed with anger. You can't do this based on the word of a junior medical officer with a personal grudge. I'm doing this based on 12 witness statements, physical evidence, and your own admission that you fired your weapon in a medical facility. Lawrence cut him off sharply. This isn't about Dr. Reynolds or Protocol Alpha 7 anymore, General. This is about fitness for command. The finality in Lawrence's voice silenced further protest. Harrington looked from the colonel to Eleanor, his expression hardening into cold fury. This isn't over, he said quietly. Protocols exist for a reason. Someday you'll face the same impossible choices I've faced, Dr. Reynolds. Then you'll understand. Perhaps, Eleanor replied evenly, but I hope I'll make those choices based on my oath as a physician, not on anger or old grievances. Lawrence dismissed Harrington to quarters and turned to Eleanor after the general had left. That was diplomatically handled, Doctor. Not everyone would maintain such composure when confronted by someone who fired a weapon over their head during surgery. Thank you, sir. I've had practice staying calm in extreme situations. Lawrence's expression became thoughtful. Harrington mentioned a personal grudge. Is there something beyond the professional disagreement I should know about? Eleanor hesitated, then decided full disclosure was necessary. General Harrington served with my father in Desert Storm, sir. He believes my father's medical decisions contributed to the death of his close friend, Captain Montgomery. The general apparently sought command here, knowing I was stationed at this FOB. Lawrence's eyebrows rose in surprise. That puts a different light on things. If Harrington pursued command specifically to confront you, that suggests a level of premeditation that's deeply concerning. I believe his implementation of Protocol Alpha 7 was genuine, sir, but his targeting of me to enforce it appears to have been personal. A dangerous combination, Lawrence observed. Genuine belief in a flawed protocol amplified by personal animosity. He made a note in the file before him. This will be included in the investigation. For now, I'm appointing Dr. Abrams as acting commander of medical operations, reporting directly to me until a permanent replacement for General Harrington can be arranged. After the meeting, Eleanor returned to the hospital to check on her patients. The news of Harrington's relief from command had spread quickly through the base, creating an atmosphere of cautious optimism among the medical staff. In the recovery ward, she found the Special Forces operator conscious and alert, his vital signs stable, despite the extensive injuries. As she reviewed his chart, he caught her eye. Doctor, he said, his voice raspy from the breathing tube that had been removed earlier. The guys told me what happened during triage, about the general and the gun. Eleanor kept her expression professionally neutral. You don't need to worry about that. Your focus should be on recovery. Still, he persisted, standing your ground against a general firing a weapon over your head while you're trying to save someone, that takes serious courage. He extended his hand. Thank you. Eleanor accepted the handshake, oddly moved by the simple gesture from a man who routinely faced death in combat. I was just doing my job. Sometimes doing your job properly is the bravest thing possible, he replied with the wisdom of someone who understood courage intimately. In the next bay, Lieutenant Fletcher lay recovering from his own surgery. Unlike the Special Forces operator, Fletcher's expression was confused and troubled as Eleanor checked his vital signs. Dr. Reynolds, he began haltingly. They told me you and Dr. Abrams both worked on me after the ambush. That's right. Dr. Abrams performed your primary surgery. I assisted when my own patient was stable. Fletcher seemed to struggle with this information. But the general ordered you to prioritize me over the other casualty. Sergeant Davies told me about the gun. Eleanor checked Fletcher's surgical dressings, giving herself a moment to frame her response carefully. Medicine isn't about choosing one life over another when both can be saved, Lieutenant. We had the capacity to treat both you and the operator simultaneously. There was no medical reason to choose. But Protocol Alpha 7, sometimes protocols need revision based on practical experience, Eleanor said gently. That's how medicine advances, by learning from each case and adapting our approach accordingly. Fletcher fell silent, processing this. Finally, he asked, will the general face court-martial for what he did? That's not for me to determine, Eleanor answered honestly. Colonel Lawrence will conduct a full investigation. The evidence will speak for itself. As Eleanor completed her rounds, she found Major Carter waiting near the nurse's station. His expression was more relaxed than she had seen since Harrington took command. Colonel Lawrence asked me to brief you, Carter began without preamble. He's implementing an immediate suspension of Protocol Alpha 7 pending full review by Central Command's Medical Ethics Committee. All treatment decisions will revert to standard triage protocols based on medical necessity. That's excellent news, Eleanor replied with genuine relief. What about the civilian patients Harrington ordered transferred? They'll remain here until medically cleared for transport, Carter confirmed. Lawrence specifically mentioned that the elderly interpreter should receive complete care, not just the minimum necessary to extract intelligence. Eleanor nodded, appreciating this return to ethical medical principles. And General Harrington, Carter's expression sobered. He's confined to quarters while Lawrence continues the investigation. The evidence is substantial. Security footage clearly shows him drawing and firing in the trauma bay. Multiple witnesses have provided consistent statements, and he hesitated. And what Lawrence discovered that Harrington specifically requested command of FOB Horizon after learning of your assignment here. He accessed your personnel file multiple times before his deployment, focusing on your relationship to your father. This confirmed what Eleanor had suspected, but still sent a chill down her spine. He came here specifically to confront me. It appears so. Lawrence is exploring whether Harrington's fixation on your father's actions in Desert Storm constitutes an unhealthy psychological pattern that may have affected his judgment in other areas as well. The implications were sobering. Harrington had spent decades nursing his grievance, allowing it to distort his professional judgment to the point of endangering patients and violating military regulations. It was a cautionary tale about the corrosive power of unresolved trauma and blame. 3 days after Lawrence's arrival, the full investigative team reached FOB Horizon. Military lawyers, medical ethicists, and senior officers from Regional Command conducted thorough interviews with everyone involved in the incidents surrounding Protocol Alpha 7 and Harrington's weapon discharge. Eleanor spent hours providing detailed testimony, describing both specific events and the broader ethical concerns raised by the protocol's implementation. Throughout, she remained focused on the medical implications rather than personal conflicts, emphasizing the life-or-death consequences of prioritizing rank over medical need. At the investigation's conclusion, Colonel Lawrence requested a meeting with Eleanor in what had been Harrington's office. The space had been transformed, the intimidating displays of medals replaced by practical maps and operational information. Lawrence himself sat behind the desk reviewing files as she entered. Dr. Reynolds, he greeted her, gesturing to a chair. Thank you for your patience throughout this process. Your testimony has been invaluable in understanding the full scope of what occurred here. Thank you, sir. What happens now? Lawrence closed the file before him. General Harrington will be transported to regional headquarters tomorrow for formal proceedings. Based on the evidence, he'll likely face charges under multiple articles of the UCMJ, including conduct unbecoming an officer, misuse of command authority, and reckless endangerment. Eleanor absorbed this without satisfaction. Despite everything Harrington had done, she took no pleasure in seeing a decorated officer's career end in disgrace. In Protocol Alpha 7, officially suspended throughout the theater, Lawrence confirmed, Central Command's medical director has issued an explicit directive that all medical facilities will continue to operate under standard triage protocols based on medical necessity, not rank or strategic value. That's good news for our patients. It's good news for the entire military, Lawrence corrected. Protocols like Alpha 7 might seem efficient on paper, but they undermine the fundamental trust soldiers place in military medicine. Knowing they'll receive care based on their medical needs rather than their rank or perceived value is essential to morale and unit cohesion. Lawrence studied her for a moment. I knew your father, you know. This surprised Eleanor. You did, sir? Not well, but we crossed paths during Desert Storm. I was a major then coordinating medical evacuations from the front lines. Your father had a reputation for exceptional skill and uncompromising ethics. He saved many lives that others might have considered lost causes. Eleanor felt a complicated surge of pride and sadness. Her father had died 3 years ago, heart attack ironically while jogging, without ever knowing how his legacy would intersect with her own career. Including the Iraqi officer that Harrington mentioned, she asked quietly. Lawrence nodded. That situation was more complex than Harrington ever understood or wanted to understand. The enemy officer your father treated was actually a high-value intelligence asset who had been working with coalition forces. His treatment was prioritized not just for humanitarian reasons, but for operational necessity. Harrington never knew this. It was classified at the time. By the time the information was declassified, Harrington had already cemented his narrative about your father's decision costing his friend's life. Some people find comfort in having someone to blame, even when the reality is more complicated. This revelation shifted Eleanor's understanding of the entire conflict. Harrington had built years of resentment on incomplete information, a tragedy of misunderstanding that had ultimately destroyed his career and nearly cost patients their lives. Does Harrington know now? She asked. I informed him yesterday, Lawrence said gravely. His reaction was difficult. 30 years of certainty about who was responsible for his friend's death suddenly undermined by new information. It's not easy to rebuild your worldview at his age. Eleanor could imagine the shock and disorientation Harrington must have felt. To have directed so much anger at her father, and by extension at her, only to discover that anger was based on a fundamental misunderstanding. What will happen to FOB Horizon now? She asked, changing the subject to more immediate concerns. Colonel Peterson will assume temporary command until a permanent replacement can be assigned, Lawrence explained. Dr. Abrams will continue to oversee medical operations with you as his deputy. I believe you've both earned that trust. As Eleanor prepared to leave, Lawrence added, one more thing, Doctor. General Harrington requested permission to speak with you before his departure tomorrow. It's entirely your decision whether to grant that request. Eleanor considered this unexpected development. Did he say why? No, but I suspect the revelations about your father may have prompted some reflection. After a moment's consideration, Eleanor nodded. I'll speak with him. The following morning, Eleanor met Harrington in a small conference room under the watchful eye of a military police officer stationed discreetly by the door. The general looked diminished somehow, his imposing physical presence undercut by the knowledge of his impending disgrace and the collapse of his long-held beliefs. Dr. Reynolds, he began awkwardly, thank you for agreeing to this meeting. Eleanor took a seat across from him. Colonel Lawrence mentioned you had something to say, General. Well, Harrington seemed to struggle with where to begin. Lawrence told me about your father's patient, the Iraqi officer, about his actual status as an intelligence asset. Yes, he mentioned that to me as well. 30 years, Harrington said quietly, almost to himself. 30 years I believed your father chose an enemy over David. I let that belief shape everything, my approach to command, my attitude toward medical priorities, He paused. My treatment of you. Eleanor remained silent, allowing him space to continue. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Harrington clarified. What I did in that trauma bay was inexcusable regardless of my personal history. But I wanted you to know that I understand now that I was wrong about your father, about Protocol Alpha 7, about a lot of things. Understanding is a start, Eleanor said carefully. But the real test is what we do with that understanding. Harrington nodded slowly. For me, that opportunity may be limited given what's ahead. But I've written a formal statement withdrawing my support for Protocol Alpha 7 and detailing its ethical flaws. Lawrence will submit it to Central Command as part of the investigation. It was a small gesture perhaps, but significant coming from a man who had been so unwavering in his certainty just days before. What about Lieutenant Fletcher? Eleanor asked. How is he processing everything that's happened? A fleeting smile crossed Harrington's face. Better than his commanding officer, I suspect. He came to see me yesterday, said something about you treating him even after I'd tried to force the issue with my sidearm. Made quite an impression on him. He's young, Eleanor observed, still forming his understanding of leadership and ethics. This experience might ultimately serve him well, painful as it is. Perhaps the same could be said for all of us, regardless of age, Harrington replied with unexpected introspection. Though some lessons come later than they should. As their brief meeting concluded, Eleanor felt not satisfaction, but a complex mixture of emotions, relief that the immediate crisis had passed, sadness for the waste of Harrington's potential as a leader, and cautious hope that some good might come from the difficult lessons learned. 3 months after the events at FOB Horizon, Eleanor found herself addressing a class of medical officers at the Military Medical Center. Colonel Lawrence had arranged the speaking engagement as part of a broader review of battlefield medical ethics prompted by the Harrington incident. Looking out at the attentive faces, some young and inexperienced others bearing the weathered look of combat veterans, Eleanor was reminded of her own journey from idealistic medical student to battle-tested combat surgeon. Military medicine exists at the intersection of two powerful traditions, she began. The warrior ethos, with its emphasis on mission accomplishment and chain of command, and the healing profession, with its commitment to preserving life regardless of circumstance. When these traditions align, we achieve our noblest purpose. When they conflict, we face our greatest challenges. She described the events at FOB Horizon without embellishment, presenting the ethical dilemmas honestly, while protecting Harrington's dignity by focusing on the systemic issues rather than personal failings. The lesson isn't that military authority and medical ethics are inherently opposed, she continued. Rather, it's that both serve the same ultimate purpose, preserving the lives and welfare of those who serve. When protocols or orders undermine that shared purpose, we have a duty to question them, regardless of our rank or position. A young lieutenant raised her hand. But how do we know when to follow orders and when to question them? The line seems unclear. The line begins with your oath, Eleanor answered. As military officers, you swore to support and defend the Constitution. As physicians, you swore to first do no harm. When an order clearly violates those fundamental commitments, the path forward becomes clearer, however difficult it may be. Another officer spoke up. What happened to General Harrington? Eleanor had anticipated this question. The general accepted responsibility for his actions and resigned his commission rather than face court-martial. He's now working with the Veterans Administration, focusing on mental health support for combat veterans struggling with unresolved trauma. This was the most surprising outcome of the entire affair. After his initial hearing, Harrington had undergone psychological evaluation that revealed decades of unprocessed grief and trauma surrounding his friend's death in Desert Storm. Rather than fight the charges, he had chosen to confront his own demons and eventually found a way to use that painful experience to help others. As the session concluded, Colonel Lawrence joined Eleanor on the stage. That was excellent, Doctor. These officers needed to hear a first-hand account of how these ethical principles apply in real combat situations. Thank you for the opportunity, sir. It's important that something positive comes from what happened at Horizon. Something already has, Lawrence observed. Central Command has formally rejected Protocol Alpha 7 and instituted new guidelines emphasizing medical necessity as the primary consideration in triage decisions. Your stand made a difference. Outside the auditorium, Eleanor was surprised to find Sergeant Major Roberts waiting. Now retired after 30 years of service, he stood in civilian clothes but with the same military bearing that had commanded respect throughout his career. Sergeant Major, she greeted him warmly. I didn't expect to see you here. Couldn't miss hearing you educate the next generation, Doctor, Roberts replied with a smile. Besides, I brought someone who wanted to meet you. He gestured to a distinguished older man standing nearby, silver-haired, with a medical corps pin on his lapel. Eleanor felt a jolt of recognition despite never having met him before. "Dr. Reynolds," Roberts said formally, "allow me to introduce Dr. William Montgomery, brother of Captain David Montgomery and former chief of surgery at Walter Reed." Eleanor shook the offered hand, momentarily speechless. Of all the people she might have expected to encounter today, a relative of the man whose death had driven Harrington's decades-long grudge was not among them. "Dr. Montgomery has been following the developments regarding Protocol Alpha 7 with particular interest," Roberts explained. "Indeed," Montgomery confirmed. "When I learned the protocol had been rejected largely due to your advocacy, I wanted to meet you personally. You see, I've spent my career trying to honor my brother's memory by improving battlefield medicine. The idea that his death would be used to justify a protocol that prioritizes rank over medical need, it troubled me deeply." "I'm sorry about your brother," Eleanor said sincerely. "From what I've heard, he was an exceptional officer." "He was," Montgomery agreed, "but he was also a true believer in the military's responsibility to provide equal care to all wounded. He would have been appalled by Protocol Alpha 7. He smiled sadly, and he would have been the first to tell Victor Harrington that his anger was misplaced." As they walked together toward the hospital exit, Montgomery added, "I've recently been appointed to the committee revising combat medical protocols. I'd value your input, Dr. Reynolds, if you are willing to contribute." "I'd be honored," Eleanor replied. Outside the Washington Monument stood silhouetted against the setting sun, a reminder of the principles that endured beyond individual conflicts and careers. Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her here from the operating rooms of Phobe Horizon to the halls where military medical policy was shaped. Her father had once told her that medicine wasn't just about healing bodies, but about preserving humanity in the most inhumane situations. Standing tall against Protocol Alpha 7, even with a general's weapon firing overhead, had been her way of honoring that legacy. The bullets in the trauma-based ceiling were long since patched, but the principles they had challenged remained intact, stronger for having been defended. In military medicine, as in life itself, some battles were worth fighting regardless of rank or risk. That was the lesson she hoped these young officers would carry forward, the courage to stand for what was right, even when standing alone, and the wisdom to distinguish between necessary orders and those that violated the very values they had sworn to uphold.